And I assume, can somebody tell me if you can see the presentation again on your screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome back, everybody. We're hoping that you had a really fruitful conversation and discussion within your smaller groups. And although we can't expand in a wider discussion, we'd love to hear some of your reflections via the chat box. And thank you again, Pauline, for helping us to capture those. We're wanting to bring these issues and the sort of the complexity that we've been discussing to a practical focus. And by that we mean to really consider the ethics of coaching across the many professional contexts that people will be exploring. It expands our knowledge about these complex contexts in which we coach. And we found from our own research that the following questions were really helpful. Very simple, practical questions. Who are you when you coach? In other words, what's your professional background? How do you define your professional identity as a coach? It was fascinating when we were writing the book and we began to explore our own experiences. Iona as an academic, myself as very much a healthcare practitioner, and Christiana as a psychologist, and just how much our backgrounds and experience both influenced the way that we worked, but how complementary it was to bring those things together in the work that we were doing. Where are you when you coach? What are the professional contexts in which you practice? Where are you choosing to coach? And how much are we consciously or subconsciously influencing those choices? And how do you coach? So how did you come to coach in the way that you do? What are the genres of practice that you're using in your coaching? There is such a plethora of choices. And I think many of us, and certainly I did, began with quite a small, narrow repertoire that expanded. So we really want to underline at this point the importance of context in which we're coaching. And our aim is to really show how we can consciously begin to explore those nuances, just how important it is to understand and navigate those boundaries if we're going to really grow in our ethical practice. Coaching is practiced in so many diverse contexts, and we need to understand their distinct characterizations. We've been able to show through our own work that irrespective of the complexity of context, there are some aspects of ethical practice which just run through these areas like a stick of rock, but there are others that are perhaps more important in many ways because they're the subtleties and the nuances that it's so easy for us to overlook in our practice. A coach's professional background really influences where and how coaching takes place. Coaching ethically across context draws on many fields of knowledge. Coaching, professional, the list goes on, and they're often reflected in the models of coaching that we're choosing to use. It's important to understand what theories and models we do use, what's influencing those, how can we push the boundaries. Just as a very brief example, I use artifacts in my professional practice, so objects and visual methods in my practice and in my research. I realised relatively recently I hadn't used artifacts and objects so much in my coaching practice, and have begun to really explore those boundaries. Ethical coaching involves being able to step back and see the whole picture of coaching within the context of which we're practicing. This is just a very brief snapshot. So on the left, the core principles, thinking about the things that Iona has already talked about: confidentiality, contracting, endings, and really thinking about how we think in a systems kind of way. We compared and explored some different contextual areas. So thinking about business contexts, asking questions like, can a line manager be a coach? Where does our duty lie in terms of care? To the system, to the coachee who brings the ethical issue, or to the system in which we're practicing? Sports contexts, and as I've already alluded to, health contexts, which make a really nice contrast? Are we really harnessing the potential in healthcare to coach? Are we coaching all staff or the people who have most access to it, those staff who are working in more senior roles? What's the role of a patient as a coach? So it's the core principles and the nuances that we're trying to distill. And Ayana, if you could just move on to the next slide. Where this really takes us is thinking about reflexivity and how that meets in terms of the boundary between the reflective practice, the reflections we all have, those kind of fairly brief reflections that you've had in the discussion this afternoon. And we conceive in our book that this is a spectrum. You'll see in the figure that reflection is situated at one side on the left and reflexivity on the right. And when we're thinking about ethical practice and we're thinking about reflexivity, we're imagining that it's a spectrum. We will all be sitting somewhere on that spectrum today, depending on our experience and our understanding of ethics. So you can explore this further, but very briefly, we would imagine that reflective practice is the very, very starting point for us all. Understanding ourselves, really becoming more self-aware. If we want, it's only once we can enter into that uncomfortableness of understanding ourselves can we begin to really understand others, the client, the coach, and the system, understanding the context in which we're working in. And Oana, you'd use the term the part and the wholes. That's absolutely what this is about. When we're doing that, we're really exploring and understanding our values, our personal values, our professional values, the organizational values, and more widely, the social values and thinking about the system. And by doing this, we begin to be able to develop much more consciously and critically our understanding of values and in relation to ethics and the dilemmas that we're confronting day to day in our coaching, but in our everyday life. We begin as we move into reflective practice to be able to really challenge our assumptions, challenge our attitudes, the philosophies and practice of our practice, challenging our habits and skills which become so embedded, and developing those reflexive questions, which we think about some of the questions that David was positing in that welcome this morning. And for us, quite simply, reflection is that in-depth consideration of what we're doing, the way we're practicing. But as we become more reflective in our practice and start to be exploring reflexivity, we're positing that sense that we begin to bend our thinking back on itself. It's a way that Webster defines it. And it's really encouraged us to be much more challenging of those things that we take for granted. Ioana, do you want to move on to the next slide?
Yes, thank you very much. So just to sum this up before we actually try to engage in a little bit of reflexive systemic thinking, we're just trying to scratch the surface as to how do we think, how do we develop a systemic mindset? And again, we are very much advocates of, if possible, simplicity and trying to capitalize on what we've already got. And here's some of the things we need to consider. First of all, as Peter Jackson and Tatiana Bachirova have mentioned, it's really important to be consciously reflexive of, first of all, our coaching philosophy, and secondly, the coaching processes we engage with and we employ as a result of these theories and philosophies we use. Quite naturally, but for some others, we may need to engage in a little bit more reflection when it comes to that. Secondly, as Paul Lawrence has mentioned, look beyond the dyadic relationship or any interpersonal relationships within the team to consider the impact of other variables in the system. And this is fairly new and fresh, but also is challenging and messy, frustrating and exciting at the same time. But it's something that we need to consider. Be open and receptive to the perspectives, but also philosophies that are different to our own. Again, in a conscious, reflexive manner. And of course, with everything we do, practice reflexively. Not only reflect, but also reflect upon our reflection. So when it comes to this, This is the scenario. Again, we're going to go into breakout rooms. And I'm pretty sure this is a question nearly all of us in one way or another have engaged with. You are an executive coach in a high-profile international organization. Your role is to support the senior leaders in their development. These are two questions we would like you to consider in your groups. First of all, the simple perennial question: who is your client? Is it the coachee, or is it the sponsor that provides our compensation? So this is the first question. And the second question, very pertinent to, very similar to the one that David Clutterbuck posed this morning: who do we owe our duty of care to? Who is our ethical responsibility to? Would it, from a systemic perspective, is it just the client and the sponsor, or are there other stakeholders that we might need to consider? So rather than just consider just the first question, who is the client? Is it the sponsor? Is it the coachee? Let's extend it a little bit to, okay, beyond these two, are there any other parts of the system we need to be considering? Once again, we're going to have about 8 minutes for discussions. And when we come back, we're just going to have engage in some reflexive thinking. I'm going to stop sharing in order to start the breakout room. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So as we're nearing the end of the session, we just wanted to keep that practical focus and think just briefly about what perhaps are some of the helpful tools and resources that we can use in our endeavour to be and to become ethical in the way that we're working, and challenges ourselves to keep revisiting these experiences and issues in the way that we've all talked about in different ways during today. So consider just for a moment tools that you connect with for supporting the development of ethical coaching for yourself, but also for others. This isn't an extensive list. There are some of the things that we talk about in our book, and some of the things that may be helpful to explore further after the session. So developing the art of good questions. And I think it's been fascinating that we both in this session have reflected back to that opening session and some of the questions that David posited then. We've shared how we've used questions in our own thinking and working, and remind ourselves how we can keep doing that as a way of really challenging our thinking. And I loved this morning how David said a really useful checkpoint was just in a year's time, just to check out our thinking about our own questions and decision making and behaviours. Using stories and reflective writing as a way for being reflective. Stories connect us with things that remind us of memories, events, connect us emotionally, not just with our thinking and more cognitive ways of working. We can write from our own perspective, but we can also write from how we imagine somebody else's perspective may be. Lots of wonderful examples. Really using the literature, the theory and the practice around thinking critically as a way of making sense of the world through that process of questioning and the questions and challenging assumptions with the aim of continually enhancing our thinking, not being afraid of that uncomfortableness. Brené Brown talks about rumbling with vulnerability. It's uncomfortable when we're putting ourselves in these positions. Thinking about supervision and self-care. Supervision can be enormously valuable as a way of creating this self-space for self-reflection and challenge. Really looking after ourselves. Continually engaging in reflective practice and our own development, and embracing creativity in the way that we've just described. Continuing to use art-based approaches as a way of connecting ourselves with ideas and sense making. And Ayana, I'm not going to dwell any further, but just hand back over to you to bring us to the end of the session. You're on mute.
in literally 5 seconds, I just want to end with these final thoughts. Developing a shared understanding of ethical standards in coaching is really key. So developing a culture that prioritizes a shared understanding of ethical standards, just like we're doing right now, sharing views and opinions. We do firmly believe that we might not need anything new. We already have excellent strategies such as contracting, reflection, supervision, CPD, open communication between us. Importantly, we need to think of how we bring our professional values and ethics to the forefront rather than the background, the solid background of our coaching practice. And finally, developing and fine-tuning asystemic thinking, which takes time, effort, messiness, complexity, but also excitement. So thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you very much, Pauline and Wendy Ann, for sorting out all the issues with the breakout rooms. And thank you for your attention.
So thank you to everybody. And in 15 minutes, there is a new session starting on education in coaching.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.